But we'll call the meeting to order at 7:06, and we stand for the pledge to the flag. Ready? Begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great. Okay, I think I did my job. Can I turn this over to you?
You can. Well, it's very nice to see everyone. It's been hard to believe, almost 2 years actually. It was April, May of 16 that we came to our final conclusion and delivered. I think it was exactly in May of 16 that we officially delivered the recommendations to the board. So just to give you guys a brief catch up as to what's happened between now and then, obviously you guys can see that I'm wearing a different hat tonight than I did when I was on the committee sitting over in that chair. Thank you. So obviously our district's gone through a lot of leadership changes. In fact, our leadership team, which consists of our principals and directors or department heads of various departments, we have 18 positions. Of those 18, 16 of us are new to either our role or our site either this year or this past year. So in the past 18 months, nearly a complete turnover in leadership, again, at least at the site. So in some cases, we had some elementary principals who rotate sites, as some of you know. And in other cases, we had brand new principals step into the role at San Antonio and Nordhoff. So quite a bit of changes there. We also underwent a process working specifically on one of the primary recommendations that our committee came up with. I believe, at least my recollection was that we said at a minimum, we really shouldn't be considering school closure until the district finally acts on the first 7-Eleven committee recommendation to really explore potentially leasing or selling this property. Now, in many different iterations or many forms that recommendation could take, but certainly that was something that I think we said pretty vocally was that this was something that it was time for us to really be looking more so at this property. The good news is, just as was the case when the initial 7-Eleven committee made the recommendation that the real estate market improved at the time that we were looking at things 2 years ago, all indications say that actually it continues to be stronger today than it was 2 years ago. So unfortunately there have been delays, but again, I think it actually may put the district in a better financial position when we do ultimately go out to solicit proposals. So what we ended up having happen though that caused some additional delays, just so you guys know, was working with the City Council and specifically the Historic Preservation Commission across the way. The Historic Preservation Commission is one of the City Council's commissions that is tasked with, among other things, analyzing properties within the city boundaries and making recommendations to the City Council on whether or not a property is of sufficient merit to either be a site of merit or the highest level of protection which the city can provide to a property is landmarking it. And so once a property does become landmarked, then there become certain burdens and restrictions on the future development or even just maintenance and reconstruction of that property. As a school district, operating as a school district here, having schools as well as district office, we're actually not subject to the Historic Preservation Commission or the City Council's declaring this a landmark as long as we remain in our current form. So they declared us, they did ultimately declare my office, the superintendent's wing, this wing of buildings here, the former bell tower, and the auditorium. So only the things which are right on Ojai Avenue is what the council ultimately approved. HPC, the commission, approved or recommended to the council this entire 7.5 acre parcel two parcels be landmarked, and so ultimately the council modified that recommendation to only have these properties here. So again, as long as the district continues to operate in its current form, that recommendation actually has no bearing on the district. We can continue to try to maintain these buildings the best possible way we can, although we all know that our buildings are in need of some TLC. And we can, again, change the, reconstruct or reconfigure or, alter the way that these buildings are currently being used, so long as it continues to, again, be under the direct use for school district purposes. Where it actually makes a difference is this process here that we're going to be talking about tonight, which is the district going out and pursuing potential proposals and possibly entering into a lease or sale agreement for all or a portion of this property. Once someone else, even if we retain ownership, once someone else, a developer or an agency uses this property for something other than what the Ed Code calls out as school district purposes, then the HPC or the City Council landmarking status does actually come into play, and so there will be restrictions on what could happen to the buildings here that, again, face Ojai Avenue. Frankly, I think that the board would likely have seen a pretty big rebellion in the community if they were interested in accepting proposals that made significant changes to the Ojai Avenue facing property. I think that the board said all along that at a minimum they were obviously very interested in maintaining the character and charm that you see from Ojai Avenue, and obviously with the goal of trying to bring up its value and aesthetic as opposed to something that'd be significantly altered. But the City Council's recommendation, again, does make it more clear for a potential developer on what the abilities for use of these buildings here would be. It gives a lot more flexibility, though, by them having a narrowed designation, a lot more flexibility of something that could take place on the rest of this campus. So that ended up being actually the HPC made a recommendation to the council at a meeting that took place in May of 17. We actually weren't informed of that meeting until after it took place, and so if you saw on the news or in the OVN or heard otherwise, that when the item came to the council in July, there was a bit of a disagreement between the board and the council as to the appropriateness of it being before them. And so ultimately they sent it back to the commission to go through the process correctly and give us our chance to know about the meeting, to be able to review the materials that they were considering, and also to make our own case as to whether or not it should be landmarked. And so that meeting with HBC took place in October. It went to the council at the end of November, and obviously we know what happened in December, and so that's why now in February we
What happened in December?
the fire.
Oh, that.
Fire?
I wasn't here.
Everything in my world stopped for a few weeks.
Only
So-
to be evacuated.
So we, for obviously, the 8 weeks following Thomas Fire, have been focused on just getting our schools back opened up and supporting kids and families as need becomes evident as a result of the tragedy. And so, that's what brings us here, February 12th of 2018, to just now be bringing up this topic when, again, it was something that I know that our committee felt pretty strongly about, again, a year and a half ago. So what is of immediate import, and the reason that we actually have assembled our committee again, I'm hopeful this actually won't be too long of a meeting, and certainly it won't necessarily require follow-up meetings, but potentially it will. We'll see how the conversation goes. You have some materials, and I apologize, this was intended to be attached to our agenda that went out last week, but I'm going to give a summary of what actually is relevant to these materials. They were actually provided back about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago to us as a larger document. And so if it looks familiar, this is not my writing, this is actually our attorney's, and again, it was a document that's been circulated in the past, but I tried to just pull out the portion that's for the lease. So again, recall our recommendation to a board was time to at least pursue options, time to take action. The board has said that they are not interested in the potential sale of this property. They believe that this is a community asset, community resource, that we can see what an enrollment projection looks like for a decade, although we've already seen how inaccurate it was. We certainly don't know what enrollment might look like 30, 40, 50, 100 years from now. And so for the district to lose such a valuable property forever when there may be need in the future, they, at least up to this point, had expressed an interest in pursuing leasing over sale. The other reason that leasing would be more advantageous is if you remember, again, I know it's been a lot of details and a couple of years ago now that we had these conversations, but lease proceeds are able to actually go directly into the general fund and able to assist a district with their operating budget. Sale proceeds have to go into a facility fund, and they'd be pretty much the equivalent of Measure J dollars for our district. So now, If it's rental income, that could still go toward facility uses. It could still go toward improving facilities, but it also can go to teacher salaries. It can also go toward textbook purchasing. It can go toward anything within our general operating budget. And so for that reason as well, it is obviously more desirable to explore a lease than to have, a one-time sale, get one-time cash up front, and then have nothing, residual. So the board has expressed an interest in leasing. At this point, they always want me to caveat that it's leasing all or a portion of, because again, there's no conclusion drawn that we'll be leasing out the entire property. It's possible that affordable housing may be what this community wants, and maybe it's only on the back portion that fronts a LISO, and we end up keeping the rest of the property as is as a district office operation, just simply pulling it in a little bit. There are lots of scenarios that could entail, the skate park right now. That's actually part of our property, as you guys know, and that was a small lease over there. So lots of different possibilities, but again, lease is really the avenue that they want to consider the potential change in status of this property. The state, and this is where we start getting into this document, the state requires that the natural process by which you explore leasing or selling a property is through a bid process. That means that we're responsible for coming up with all of the terms of the deal, terms of the sale or terms of the lease. We have to publicize it. We go through a few exercises, and then ultimately we wait for about a month or two while people can mail in their response, what their bid would be. It sounds exciting to me. I kind of want to try it just because it could be fun. But I've heard it can be heated because you actually have a public forum, a public meeting, board meeting, where you open up each of those sealed bids that were mailed to you, and you read aloud what the bid was. And then anyone in the audience has the ability to increase the bid by 5% for themselves. So let's say, a government agency bid $1 million to lease this property, but a real estate developer wanted to do something different with it. In person, when they hear that the high bid was $1 million, they could come in and say, I'll go, $1,050,000, and we'd have to give it to that person. So the requirements around a bid, and the reason that we really don't want to explore bid, and I try to detail this a little bit in the email, is it really does tie the hands of the district to...
You have to accept it.
You have to accept it, exactly. You have to accept the high bid. You don't have the ability to really have other factors come into play. And so if you look at on here, if you go to page 4, you'll see it talks a bit about the exciting board meeting to receive sealed proposals. And so I'm now in the third paragraph of that board meeting to receive sealed proposals. The procedures discussed above require the award to the highest possible or responsible bidder, and thus all proposals are rejected. So a district does still maintain the ability to say no one is responsive to, meets our internal threshold of purchase price, and so we'll reject everyone. But they don't lend themselves to flex building the award of proposals based on non-monetary consideration. And that's what our board has really says, that they don't want to be forced into, let's say, the worst scenario we can think of, an 8-story Trump Tower casino. Can't get worse than that. So, so let's say that was your pick. Let's say that project was, though, a responsive bid, and they came in at the highest possible price point. The district would be forced to accept that rather than any other offer. Again, we would have the ability to just say no, forget it, we're not doing anything, but it would close off our ability to accept anything else.
However, there's a large amount of effort on the part of the district in setting all the requirements at the outset. And then if you're going to reject a bid, you have to reject it on the basis of non-compliance with those requirements. You can't just say, we don't like any of these bidders. You have to say, here's what you have to do if you're going to bid on this project and be compliant with our requirements. And if you're not compliant with any particular requirement or subset of requirements, then your bid can be thrown out. But if you comply with every requirement and the district, for whatever reason, hasn't put down every spoken, unspoken, thought and unthought requirement, then those don't have to be met.
Yeah.
Unless a
But
monetary.
Because they're
unless a
not,
monetary-
they're not in the paper.
But you are required to take that bid. If it's the highest, you have to take it.
The
As
highest
long as-
compliant bid.
Unless it conforms to all requirements.
Right, and so that's a second reality, and Steve, everything you said is correct. That's a second reality of the challenge. Lends itself far more easily to a sale, where you don't have that many other terms other than what you're focused on price. Once you start trying to, I mean, if anyone has even rented or leased a vehicle, much less a home, much less, a major commercial property, there's so many different terms that come into play with a lease that the reality is, and you probably won't have a single person that actually accepts every term as you've requested, and so that therefore also throws us out of the bid process anyway. And so for those reasons, we do believe that the waiver process gives the district the greatest flexibility in considering all proposals, even if, again, it doesn't bring in the same revenue that 8-story casino hotel might bring in. So the other alternative, I think what maybe Steve was leading toward, was the district would have the ability, if we said that we knew with certainty that we wanted affordable housing as an element, we wanted power generation, renewable energy generation as another element, and we wanted to have some space that supported, at least 1 acre devoted to supporting the arts and performing arts, we'll say, in Ojai, then perhaps we could structure something with such specificity that the only way someone could respond would be meeting those terms. But again, the board has said we don't want to be that prescriptive. That would be an absurd process, and really what we want is to have other agencies, other individuals, other developers to come forward and give us what they believe to be the highest and best use for this property, and then allow that community dialogue to engage in, does it make sense to make a trade-off on revenue of $100,000 a year if it's something that we all think is better. And so rather than us be so prescriptive as to the possible uses of this property and not realize what we're foreclosing, what we're closing off the opportunity to hear, we'd rather cast as wide a net as possible, and then once we hear the responses and we know all the options on the table, we'd be able to, again, hear from the community and hear from the various stakeholders and be able to ultimately decide.
Does the district alone get to prescribe all those parameters? Whether we do waiver or not waiver, does the city get involved? If we do a waiver, does that mean the city can get involved? I mean,
so the city is going to be very involved ultimately in what happens here. I mean, anything that changes from the current zoning is going to be something that has to go back to the city. So anything that's not, in essence, a public body using this for educational purposes, I mean, it's pretty restricted in what zoning we currently have. Any businesses that are going to have to go through various business permitting steps as well. There's going to be many ways that the city will be involved in this process. So certainly our interest is aligned with the city to work together on trying to meet as much of both of our needs as possible, because nothing's going to happen on the site if the district doesn't want it, and frankly nothing's going to happen on the site if the city doesn't want it. It's definitely going to be something that both agencies are involved in.
okay.
And you can imagine a level of use that actually would require a general plan amendment. You could see that, you could actually reach that point
Absolutely.
very easily.
Yeah,
Sure,
absolutely.
Because this is VMU, even though it's currently PL zoned. This is in the village mixed use portion of the city, if not the city core. And if someone wants to have a commercial operation here, the first thing you have to do is get it rezoned.
That's what I'm
Or
talking
at
about.
least get an overlay on the zone that says it's still VMU, it's still PL, but this specific property can be used for something else as well. That goes through my planning commission and for recommendation to the city council. But either way, it's gonna be tough on the district. If you went through the standard bid process, there's this huge bow wave at the beginning, making sure that you get all the requirements accurate, complete, comprehensive, and acceptable to the community as well as the board. And then the grading of all the responses is easy because you can just check them off. Did they say yes to everything or did they not? If you lay out some vague requirements, I don't mean vague
Sure.
pejoratively,
Sure.
but if you lay out, say, more flexible requirements, then you're gonna get a variety of responses of different flavors. And Then the front end of that process is relatively easy on the district, but the back end is very hard because you're not comparing apples and apples and saying which apple is more expensive. So one way or another, this is a huge burden on the district staff. There's no question of that. The question is, what's better for the district? Do you want to take the district staff offline for a year to write a perfect set of requirements?
Yeah.
You still have to worry about the city afterwards in any case. But do you want to do that, or do you want to have some kind of iterative process and public process whereby all these varying responses are judged one against another?
Well, but I also see the possibility that if you go the waiver thing, you don't look for the, and do not do the bid process, then, and the process of envisioning the use of this property, you know, I think it's going to be it's going to be a high probability that you're going to form strategic partnerships to get this done. So that burden is not going to fully fall on the district to do that. It's just not going to happen. That's my vision of this thing, is that to do what I think ought to be done, or something online, which I think quite a few people would agree with, and it's been expressed in this committee by a number of people, then you're looking at strategic partnerships and other people to take up some of that administrative burden and development burden to do that. So I think in the end, it's going to be something that's more invigorating than the bid process. Though it might be taxing, but I think it's going to be more invigorating and more inspiring.
So, Chris, are you saying that you already have a great idea?
I've heard a bunch of good ideas expressed. I heard a couple from Andy just a few minutes ago.
You're not coming with a great idea that you're hoping the board will build on.
Are you trying to lease this property?
I have put it out there. If anybody, they want to hear my ideas, I'm happy to express them. So far, I have had no invitations. I take that as a clear message. So I'm happy to give it if anybody's interested on the board, but so far that hasn't happened, that's fine. But I've heard lots of good ideas.
Wouldn't it be amazing if somebody came to the board with something that was just irresistible that everybody loved?
Is that what the waiver process allows
That's
It allows that to happen.
what the
Yeah.
waiver allows the district to do.
Right.
Well, one thing that I love about the waiver process also is that the spirit of this committee, and the reason I loved being on it so much, even though at times we felt like we were in the crosshairs, we really engendered just a great input from our community. They really felt like they were heard. And I think that the waiver process will be a continuance of that, sort of spirit. One question that I have is highest and best use of the property. So you went over that. Is that something that can be predetermined, or is that something on the back end, like Steve was saying, the school board itself will determine the highest and best use?
So there's a legal answer, there's a practical, responsible answer. So legal answer is, as Steve I think really eloquently said, I mean really it's going to happen at some time. It's either going to happen on the front end. If we were going through the bid process, it would be a really intense front end decision.
To define that highest and best
Correct.
use. Yeah.
Through the waiver, it allows us, instead of us doing that in the front end, which one might incur a lot of time, either of my own staff's or my own time, might incur some significant legal fees. And frankly, I still am not that certain that there is going to be a responsive proposal, regardless of that ends up happening, that actually meets all of our needs financially moving off the site, and also is really something the community supports and makes it worth our while. So we'd be incurring a lot of upfront time and expense potentially, and closing off the ability to have other ideas that we even think about during that process come forward. The waiver process allows it to kind of come in the opposite order when we actually, and hopefully actually spread that risk of, for lack of a better term, wasted time and effort to the developer as opposed to the district. And so now they're going. And when I say developer, let me be clear. That's not just a commercial developer who may want to come in and it could be some of the joint partnerships that I've heard Chris talk about, or others. As far as varying different concepts that have come forward. So I'll just say developer as a general term of someone that might do something different, develop the space for something other than what's currently being used for. A developer comes forward And they're gonna be the ones that have to spend some of the time on the front end developing that concept and bringing it forward. Legally, the board's the one that's gonna make the decision again on ultimately what they accept. Now, again, practically and politically within this community, the board has stated on many occasions, and I'm certain that they would do this, is that they're not going to be making that decision in isolation of what, of community feedback through the exact process you talked about, Linda. It's going to be committee meetings, it's going to be public hearings at Matilla Auditorium that will be well attended, and give people a chance really to share their thoughts on as they weigh through how to consider different possibilities of re-envisioning this space.
So is this a state requirement? The state requires you to take the highest bid?
State requires the default process through bid, which exactly requires that.
Okay.
So what we're talking about doing is that we just call it the waiver process, but it's literally submitting a waiver to waive out of that bid requirement to give ourselves more local flexibility.
So does the city have the same power if you go and make
Yes.
all the prescriptives? It would be just as involved to try to meet all the requirements versus, you allow the waiver process and all of a sudden the city still has equal say.
City's gonna ultimately be equally involved. I would imagine if a district were to develop the more prescriptive method on the front end using a bid process, they would be foolish not to have a greater dialogue with the city on the front end and with with Steve's committee as well, to make sure that we're not so narrowly focusing the possible responses that had no chance from the front end of actually being approved by the city, for
Yeah.
rezoning, for everything else. So obviously, if we were going to take that approach of saying we're only, instead of being able to cast that really wide net, we're going to be looking at a very narrow set of possible responses, it would certainly make sense that we would try to get other public bodies on board with that very narrow focus at first. But
Because-
ultimately, their role and rights will be the same
The same.
regardless.
So under equal scenario, they can manipulate what happens in the process. It's not like
Good
if
point.
we do the waiver, we're then losing power to the city. That would be my
Correct.
only concern.
That's correct.
We do the waiver and then all of a sudden the city has more say, more
In
power.
terms
in
of
how-
zoning, the school board never had the power.
Okay, so we're not losing anything.
In terms of the city as a whole, you're on the planning commission, I
Yes,
spent
sir.
6 years on the arts commission, you've got the historical preservation commission, you got the recreation commission. Everybody's gonna have a say-so.
Okay, and equally whether you do a bid process or you do.
Yeah, regardless.
It'd be no more, no less than any other development process.
What it comes down to, let's say it's the back 5 acres here that the district wants to lease to someone. Okay, once again, if they make a very, even with consultation with everybody you can imagine, come up with a very narrowly defined prescriptive type request for proposals, if you will, then they can say, yes, this person meets it and has the high number. The fact that it is very prescriptive, whether it's been socialized with all the other agencies or not, makes it easier for the city to say yes or no, because they only have this one thing to look
Yeah.
at. If, on the other hand, we go through and request and are granted a waiver from the bid process, then, as I mentioned earlier, it's harder on the district, on the back end, to weigh varying responses, okay? It is equally harder for the city unless the district has said, okay, we've looked at these 7 different responses and we like number 4, okay? Then they go back to the city and say, okay, now what kind of Mother May I stuff do we have to go through with you to get number 4 through?
I know, I think my concern is this. Let's say you go to the city firsthand, you get all the prescriptions, you come in, you have it all defined, someone comes in with a high bid, you have to take that bid, right? So it has to be done. And the other way around, are we dependent on the city giving us all these approvals? Have we just given them too much power?
Well, again, they're going to have the
Other-
same. They're going to have the same
The city
power
has that.
regardless.
Regardless.
That's what's
Yes.
endowed to them as their, structure of their.
Yeah, I
So
can just
even
say-
after the bid process, they
Mhm.
would still have, like, even at, the state wouldn't force them to
No.
then,
No.
they'd still have all the nitpicky, like,
Absolutely.
okay.
Yes.
But if
Absolutely.
you've made them agree to everything on the upfront,
Again, I was on the Arts Commission and went through all, with the Libby Bowl, with
Yeah.
the skate park. Everything goes through that same process. There's no changing it.
So here's ultimately what I believe. Again, I keep using that term of casting a wide net. I really believe that I think that at times in the past, either the school district or our community has made trade-offs without realizing what we're actually trading off. And so I believe strongly that the reason the waiver is best for us is that I'd rather cast that wider net on the front end, not being so narrowly prescriptive, but allowing for different things to come forward, and then we can really engage in the conversation of, let's go away from that 8-story casino and say, does this community want another hotel? Or do we want affordable housing? Well, I think right now I'm hearing a little bit more in the community for affordable housing, probably if those were the only 2 choices that we had. But if affordable housing garners the district $10,000, doesn't even pay for us to move off the site, much less a potential new lease required to house our 2 schools currently on the site, and a, Sunito-esque casino, or not casino, hotel that also had a local space that was focused on performing arts, incorporated, or had this or had that. And that one was a $2 million a year revenue generator for the district, which allows us to have among the highest paid teachers in the county and lower class sizes. Now that it's kind of like what I was saying before our meeting started, which will be very out of context here, but it's kind of the puppy and the cat question. If you're only looking at, do we prefer to have this type of development or this type, it's really hard to look at those 2 things without knowing what's traded off by those. And obviously one of the things that's being traded off would be financial remuneration for the district.
okay, so my next question would be, in a decision like that,
Yeah.
like, okay, so we could make 10,000 from this, everybody wants, but affordable housing, but we
Mhm.
could make 2 million from
Right.
doing, who has the ultimate say? Like, 2 million is way better for us, for the district, but is the
Right.
district gonna be able to say, this is what we want?
No question, this is going to be a political process. The board is the one that accepts the responses. But there's going to be, as now Dimitri and Steve both said, there definitely are going to be other agencies involved in ultimately whether or not that number 4 respondent actually is able to go forward with the exact proposal that came to us initially, or if there's going to have to be alterations or modifications to the proposal based on those various agencies. So
Yeah, because
again,
it seems to me you could get in a stalemate. I mean, maybe that
well,
happens with either
and that's
process.
I mean, it does
You know.
happen potentially in their process. I'll just say, people keep asking me when this might happen. I think that best case scenario, assuming that this board or this committee supports the board's and district's desire to move forward with the waiver process, whenever we submit our waiver application, which would likely be in March, it will be 3 to 4 months before the California State Board of Education would approve that waiver request. From that period, we're likely looking at a 3 to 6 month advertising and solicitation of bid period. At minimum 3 months. You really would, obviously, with something this significant, want to have some time. Whenever we ultimately, again, have those community meetings and all the other avenues for feedback on the proposals, let's say the board's able to make their selection among the responses, guaranteed that there will be somewhere between a 12 and 36 month period of due diligence. And so, we aren't even testing, people keep asking, do we have a full soils environmental testing, for this property? No, we don't. That's something that, again, we are holding off on undertaking now in the event that nothing ends up happening to this property. We don't want to be, footing $100,000 of expenses to prepare this for a potential RFP process. We'd rather have a developer who comes forward with the idea, who then spends that 12 to 24, 36 months working with the city, working with those various commissions, doing their necessary due diligence on this property before we actually would have, the lease finalized and get to the point of no return. So it's possible that we could be still 3 to 4 years away from actually a new project breaking ground on this property.
Andy, I've got a quick question, Andy.
Yeah.
Just to make sure we're not getting too deep into it. On page 6, the row G,
Uh-huh.
I know I was an exclusive representative of the employees when I was an employee of the district. Do I
Yes.
still qualify and meet that term as I'm no longer employed. Am I still considered an exclusive representative of employees?
No, why?
Because that's one of the, is this on row G, it says the exclusive representative, if any, as provided.
This isn't
Was
saying-
not a participant in the development of the waiver.
Right. So this isn't the only, so great point. So actually, if you jump back to page 5, and we actually happen to have a current sitting member of the bargaining unit here in the audience.
Totally.
The sole member of the audience.
The audience is full of people like that.
That's good. The,
What are we
uh,
looking at?
So you
Majority
wanna-
of this
are you gonna
audience,
review
just
the,
so you know.
tell us what the process is? I
Yeah.
understand you're wanting us to
so exactly.
approve the
So
waiver, so.
So we ultimately, to be able to submit the waiver to the state, a few things have to take place. One, this committee had to be able to be asked and hopefully make a recommendation to support the district's efforts to seek that waiver. Separate from this process, we have to have the same thing take place with both unions.
Okay.
And so I've already begun talking to both Chuck and Angie, you know,
And
yeah, and now the
soul.
entire audience is, exactly. So we've already begun having those conversations, and we need to figure out from our attorney if there's actually gonna be a formal vote that's necessitated of the membership, or, because ultimately, if you see here, page 5, the procedure, paragraph 2, it says, first, the school district should consult with any employee collective bargaining units. Note that the school district's obligation to consult unions is not limited to employee contract issues, so it would still apply to these property transactions. Although union support is not a required condition for approval, the request must reflect the school district's efforts to involve any bargaining units.
Okay.
So we have to involve them in the process, and again, obviously, we're going to be working very closely and
Just making sure it wasn't
a
a representative
support.
on out of
No,
the
no,
11
no.
people. Okay.
No, that was saying that the state must approve the request unless they find one of the items listed on pages 5 and 6.
Perfect.
So, no, ultimately, what will happen, again, if we get this committee to support the district's request, that will be one more checkbox on our application that goes up to the state, that they'll ask us, did you consult your bargaining units, your employee representative groups? And we'd say, yes, we consulted with them. Did you consult with 7-Eleven? Did they make a recommendation? Yes, we consulted, and yes, they made the recommendation, supporting it. Do you guys have evidence that this is not going to be needed or you have the means to operate this, these functions on another site? Okay, that will be part of our applications, having to evidence that we have the ability to operate, that we will not be harming students by moving off the site. Now, if the State Board of Education does not feel that we were persuasive in our argument that students would not be harmed by moving off the site, then that would be one of the reasons why they can deny our waiver request, and that would then force us to remain in the bid process. So that's how it actually works.
And just to point out, reading this same page of the document, you have to conduct a public hearing as
Right,
well.
absolutely.
That is, to give notice and to invite public
Right.
input on the concept.
Exactly, that's right.
So can we go through those procedures real briefly, because I was underlining them and just gonna ask questions. First, the school district must consult with any employee collective bargaining units, you went over that. Then, the request must also be evaluated by the school district's advisory committee. Is
So that also includes, that also includes though, like our English language, I'm sorry, what's ELAC, DLAC, Merv, Angie, can either of you help me with,
LPAC.
LPAC would also be one, but DLAC and ELAC do District English Language Advisory Committee, perhaps, I think.
Sounds right, yeah.
So there are some other committees that will also, again, so really what they want to have as part of that waiver package is to know that there's not, 5 board members in a closed session saying that they're going to bypass the natural way that the state says that you're supposed to dispose of this property. Ultimately, what they're most concerned with, frankly, is the possibility of corruption, the possibility that rather than going through a bid process where we'd have to take the high bid, we want to do something else that would allow us to sell it to our brother for, something less than
That was the
about.
first thing Darren said.
Oh,
So
yeah.
this
My
is-
husband, when I brought it up,
That's a great idea.
I'm all, oh, this should be super quick. And Darren's all, no.
Somebody leaked.
So the procedural, it basically sets up a standard by which it's full disclosure, basically,
Exactly.
across all
Precisely.
committees.
That's
and-
exactly right.
okay.
Exactly right.
Alright.
So then we ultimately, have a public hearing that there's requirements for a certain notice period. The actual waiver packet in its entirety will be will be made public, and so everyone's able to see it. There's again a certain notice period that's required. And then we'll have that public hearing where, again, if at that point anyone still feels that they've not had a chance to be heard as to whether or not they support the district's request to go through with a waiver rather than go through the bid process, they could be heard at that point as well.
And all of that will be done with Spanish translation as well, because we learned that during our 7-Eleven process, how important that was.
Absolutely.
The outreach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you said you were hoping to submit the waiver in March.
That's correct. Public hearing in March.
So all of this that we've just been discussing here is gonna take place in the next 30 days or so.
Ish, yes.
40 days.
Right.
45 days.
Yes,
That's a pretty tall order.
we're busy.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes, he is.
But then, when you've done that, then you wait till June or July or
Exactly.
whatever
Precisely.
to get a decision. If the decision is yes, you have been granted your waiver, then you go back into a new round of discussion with all of these advisory committees, bargaining units, city bodies, because you want to reflect all of that in what you put out for people to provide responses to. So there's a lot of meetings in your
There's certainly
future.
gonna be a lot of meetings, no question about that.
I have a question.
Yes.
So how is it that the district can protect its interests? Is there a way that you can protect your interests, or is this just gonna be like you know, meetings between us and the district and the city, trying to hammer out who benefits from whatever, whatever proposals? How do you protect the district?
So-
How do we
Well,
like?
that's-
You mean,
I don't, yeah, I mean, I certainly up to this point, we could have done things perhaps a little bit more positively in our interaction between HBC, City Council, and the school board. But I don't think that our interests are, mutually exclusive. I know that there's plenty of overlap, and I am very confident in our ability to work together with the city and its various committees and commissions. So I'm not fearful that the district is going to, lose a valuable bargaining position that the city is going to take advantage of us for. I believe, again, I am confident that we can work collaboratively with them. Ultimately, though, again, each of us have our own roles in this, and there's nothing that we can do that's going to erode the authority that the city has, because the city's authority, does not come from us granting it to them. It comes from their charter with the state and with their, with various governmental codes that impact them.
Yeah.
So,
And
And the other-
basically, the city is responsible for everybody, so it has to come down.
Well,
to
ultimately, you have the protection that any property owner has, and that is when you don't agree to go forward with the
Right.
development, if they put
Okay,
conditions
that's
and
what I
make it
needed to know.
uneconomical.
Yeah,
The
okay.
final decision is what to do with this property
Yeah.
is gonna all be made by the board.
yes.
Yeah.
And so they don't lose anything. It's no different than any other development project, and the give and take and the changes and the adjustments and the requirements and all the hearings and all the meetings and all the permitting and all the studies are all the same in this process. You can't get out of that.
Yeah.
The fact that this is a politicized situation is not necessarily a negative thing. A lot of people are looking at that. The city has already expressed its desire to benefit the community from its development, and they have themselves put it out there that they want a qualitative development. That's what I've heard from them on this property. So I'm very familiar with what, there's been interaction between the city and the board and the administration, and I think the chances for a collaborative process that ultimately turns out to be beneficial, I think that probability is higher than going the other way.
But yeah, Chris, everything you said again, I appreciate and I agree with. But I want to reiterate, at any point along this process, the school district we have the ability to, just because we're going through the waiver process doesn't mean we must accept one of them now. We have the ability to decline all offers. We also have the ability at any time during this process to rescind our declaration of this property as surplus. So remember, the board did actually make that decision in November of, now let's figure out dates, November of 16. It was Linda Taylor's last meeting before Shelley Griffin was sworn in December. At that November meeting is when they did declare, again, this property surplus. But even at that meeting, made very clear that they did that because that's a necessary step along this long path that we've been outlining as to how we can
And a
eventually.
reversible step. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
well, and I'm hearing you say too, Andy, and I think everyone else is kind of coming to terms with the fact that the bid process is a much less powerful position than perhaps the waiver process, because you can choose to step away if, again, you know, a decision or a project is submitted that just doesn't make sense to us, whether it's now in the moment of it being presented or even later as it plays out with the city, et cetera. It's
I absolutely agree with you. It's a more empowering process for the
empowering
district.
process.
And
Okay.
you
The
can
bid process does
ultimately
allow us to
revert
walk
the
away.
Bid
with-
process, you can
Right.
ultimately revert to it.
Right,
If you
absolutely.
want to. You can't go back the other way.
Right,
Oh, okay,
right.
that's good to know.
That's
Right.
interesting.
No.
Thank you.
Can I make a motion to sign a waiver?
Second?
Ow.
Okay, any further discussion? All right.
Just take a vote?
Oh, yes.
Just a question. So then you say if in the process, all this process is already done, but then the board decide to change their mind and say, we're just gonna leave it as it is because whatever reason you have the power to do that.
Absolutely.
And then you're not gonna be forced to
Right.
make that decision or to take the projects at all.
That's correct.
Or,
That's
yeah,
correct.
the city council or any one of the boards and commissions in the city could be hard line about certain requirements being put on a lease that the board finds unacceptable. Then the board can say, fine, we're not gonna do it.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Which I like. That to me is the best position for what you were discussing. How do we make sure that the school district can protect its interests?
Well, what I want is the school district to make as much money from the property as they can. That's the
I think
interest
Andy
I
wants
want to
that too.
protect.
Yeah.
So I want to
Which
make
is the
sure we
point.
don't lose anything, and I know we don't by the waiver process, but I'm worried
More than
about
we had to
what's our position of power and how do we
Well,
maintain
Melanie,
it.
I don't know that we want the district to make as much money as possible. If you take it to the extreme, what Andy just said, like the Trump
Casino.
power casino. I mean, I
Casino.
think that this is a huge, we all know it's a huge asset for the community, and that I think this process is necessary. I don't see us pitting each other against each other, and I would never want us to go for the highest dollar. We would go for the big process.
Totally agree with what you're saying, except I want to make sure that when it comes to the city's interests and the district's interests, we can make as much money as we can off the property. And that we don't sacrifice to the city because the city's saying, you
How's
have to
going-
have like.
But how's going through the waiver process?
No, I don't think, I
Okay,
just,
so
I
that's
was
a
worried,
separate
that was,
concern,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
because
that was my only
the
concern
waiver's
is,
not gonna
I don't, I wanna
negate
make
going through the
sure.
audit.
Exactly.
So
Whether
this
you're in
waiver
a
is
bid
a
or a
tip-
waiver
Right,
process.
you guys answered
it's the
that, I
same-
think.
It's the same issue for the
Yes.
district.
The city
on
can
how it
make
makes
it
its
easy or
decision.
hard,
Either way,
either way.
yeah, that's all I
So
want.
you're-
And that's
Your concern is
commission
the
by
interest.
commission.
Yeah,
So,
Exactly.
Already
So,
done that.
Mark,
For a-
Murphy,
Any other discussion?
It is exhausting.
Okay, all those in favor of approving the district's request for a waiver application to the State Board of Education,
Perfect. That's excellent.
say aye.
one
Aye.
aye.
Any opposed?
I'm gonna abstain.
And one abstention.
Approving a waiver for the, say it again?
The waiver
Wording's on number
application to the State Board of Education.
Requesting a waiver from the standard bid process.
Yeah.
Well, it's more than that.
The district seeks a waiver from the
Because
default
you
bid
waive
process,
all
request the committee
requirements
take
but
action to
those
support
two.
the district's.
general waiver
Right.
request.
It's more than just the bid process. You
Well,
no.
waive other
From
requirements
the default bid.
in addition
From
to
the
that.
default bid process.
Yeah, from the default leasing process.
Which is the bid process.
Okay.
Okay,
But you
well,
also have other restrictions as well if you don't waive them, according to this document.
All of that though is under the umbrella of
Okay.
the default bid
So
process.
all in favor, and Andy is abstaining. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes, Dr. White did not vote.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
impressive
I-
turnout.
I
Yeah,
just
I'm-
say that I'm the eternal optimist, and I think that we as a community will come to something that we'll all be happy with.
I agree.
I agree.
Because this is a remarkable property in such a key area, and it's got wonderful potential for everyone, because it's not pitting us against the city, we're part of the city, it's really, it's a community.
I hope you're correct, I really do.
Yeah,
I 100% hope you're correct.
Now,
great.
Well, guys, I am really grateful to, as Lynn said, have
I have
the,
another motion to make, since we're
Oh.
all here, that has nothing to do with the waiver, but I'm just gonna say, well, we're all here.
What,
We spent a lot of time working on the 7-Eleven committee, and we had a lot of recommendations. And I would like to see something similar to, it doesn't have to be that formal, as the grand jury, that when a report is made, that the governing body then says whether it agrees or disagrees with what has been recommended and what it has and hasn't done. So, for instance, I have our final report that we had. We had some really good recommendations beyond just leasing or selling this building. And I'm thrilled, for instance, with the efforts for the nutrition program. So I would like to make a motion that, it doesn't have to be done at once, I know you guys have a lot on your agendas, very full agendas, but I would like to see similarly how you go through your board policies, that you also go through these as time allows, like within a time frame, like within a year. And you say, we've done this much on this recommendation, we think this recommendation isn't gonna work for us at this time. We'd like to work on this and have a discussion. Like I said, it's not gonna be like a huge thing for everybody. So let me just make that motion.
So if I can respond real quick before anyone else
Yes.
does. This is actually a Brown Act body. And so
That
we
is
don't,
true.
unfortunately, we don't have the ability to make a motion or approve something wasn't
That is true.
agendized.
Thank you.
So how about this, I hear your concern, and not as my role as a committee member, but my role as superintendent, I'll commit to you to follow up with you and see what we can do to meet the spirit or the letter of what you're asking.
Thank you for bringing the Brown Act. I love that you did that. All my enthusiasm for not having us just be a rubber stamp is has made me not see that that's very important. So thank you.
But I hear what you're saying, and
It's a
We'll
good
be in
idea.
touch.
All right,
It's a very
great.
good
So
idea.
I just
Thank you
have a
for saving
question.
these. in case
yeah,
you ever need to
oh,
reuse
absolutely.
them again.
That's right.
Never know.
I have mine in my house. Did you get another one up?
Do you have yours?
Made a new one?
I have been stereo now, looking at me like, I got mine on my desk. I got two on my desk now, yeah. Behind me in front of me.
Has a comment.
Well, I just like to know, when we will find out about if we were approved for the waiver, and then if there's gonna be any following meetings with the 7-Eleven committee?
There is, so at this time, I mean, I thought we said this a year and a half ago, but at this time, I truly do not imagine you guys being reconvened again. So this is a little bit sad that once again, this will be our farewell. But I really sincerely appreciate each of you finding the time to be able to come tonight. I know when I sent out the request that all of you are very busy. This was the best day that worked. I know a number of you had to make changes to be able to make it tonight, and so I really do appreciate
I want
it.
everybody to know that I had breakfast in Bloomington, Indiana this morning. I just came straight from the airport.
That's why you're here? And then to answer your second question, the waiver, we would hear from the state 3 to 4 months, you said, after we submit the waiver
Right,
application?
so we should be hearing right as we're entering summer.
All right.
Assuming that we're able to get submitted in March, they only meet every 2 months, so it'll be the next time we can get onto their agenda to have them approve it.
Okay.
So,
Speaking of an eternal optimist, yeah.
yeah. Which is why I say 4 months, because that means typically we push back, at least one meeting.
Well, you know, half the audience wants me to go, so.
The other half doesn't.
Chuck wants me to go too. He's not even around here.